I pushed the red-tabbed federal fraud file across the mahogany grain. It slid right past my mother's famous Sunday pot roast and came to a halt in the center of the table. Pastor Miller dropped his fork. A bead of brown gravy stained his crisp white collar. My father's face turned the color of wet ash. I leaned back in my wooden chair, rested my hands in my lap, and gave the people who raised me 3 options. Sign the confession right now, hand over the deed to your house, or keep chewing and wait for the FBI to knock on the front door. The silence in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. My sister Tara sat rigid beside them. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles lost all their color. To understand how my younger sister's $350,000 fresh start ended with our parents staring down federal prison time, you have to rewind 3 weeks. The true collapse did not start with a screaming match over a dinner table. It started with a silent screen in the dark. My name is Zelda Fletcher. I am 32 years old, and I work as a forestry consultant in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. My days are spent analyzing soil density, managing timber harvests, and navigating unpredictable terrain. It was a Tuesday, just past 2 in the morning. I was sitting at the drafting desk in my cabin, nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee while reviewing topographic maps. The wind was howling through the pines outside, rattling the single-pane glass. My phone screen lit up, cutting through the shadows. It was not a text from a friend or a late-night work email. It was an automated property tax alert from the county clerk's portal. The notification read, "Notice of recording, quitclaim deed transfer, parcel ID 440912. That parcel was 50 acres of virgin timberland my grandfather left to me. It was the sanctuary I had spent my entire adult life protecting. My pulse tapped a steady rhythm against my ribs. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not spend their lives working in bear country. Then the text messages started rolling in. The first was from my father, Hank. "Hey, sweetie, the bank might call to verify some routine paperwork in the morning. Do not sweat it. Your name is already on the forms. See you Sunday." Before I could process the fact that my father was casually laughing off a felony, my mother, Brenda, sent a message. "Tara finally found her calling with this glamping resort. She needs a fresh start. You have had yours. Family helps family." Seconds later, my sister Tara chimed in. "Love you for this, sis. Wait till you see the renderings." I read the messages twice. The audacity was almost clinical. They had not asked for a loan. They had not pitched a business idea. They had hijacked my identity, leveraged my inheritance, and announced the debt as if my pristine credit score was community property. I did not argue. I did not call them crying. I took screenshots of every single message, saved them to a secure encrypted folder, and forwarded the entire chain to my attorney. Before I explain how I turned my family's theft into the trap that cost them everything, tell me your age, what time it is, and where you are watching QT Told Stories from. I want to know how far this story travels before the truth finally catches up with them. I spent the next 3 hours in the dark tracking down exactly what they had done. I logged into the public records database and began cross-referencing parcel maps with shadow banking registries. It did not take long to unearth the paperwork. Someone had filed a massive commercial lien against my land. This was not a standard business loan from a local credit union. It was a high-interest, hard money loan issued by a private syndicate out of Little Rock. Predatory lenders do not ask many questions, as long as the collateral is solid, and 50 acres of old-growth Ozark oak and pine is as solid as it gets. I downloaded the PDF of the lending agreement. The borrower listed on the digital ink was Fletcher Eco Glamping, LLC. The primary guarantor was Zelda Fletcher. I zoomed in on the signature line. It bore the heavy-handed loop my father always used on his capital Z's. It was a habit he developed signing lumber manifests for 30 years. They had dusted off an expired financial power of attorney from my college days, slapped it onto a commercial lending contract, and offered up my grandfather's legacy on a silver platter. As the sun crested the ridge outside my window, painting the forest canopy in bruised shades of purple and orange, the reality of their plan crystallized in my mind. They expected me to swallow the theft. They expected me to absorb the financial blow, just like I had absorbed every other slight and every passed-over birthday. My mother had spent my entire childhood teaching me that Southern hospitality meant keeping the peace at all costs. She believed that daughters were supposed to shrink themselves to make room for the golden child's unending drama. Tara had already failed at 3 different multi-level marketing schemes. Now she wanted to play the role of a luxury resort CEO, and my parents decided I was going to foot the $350,000 bill. I opened a new email draft to Wyatt Sterling. Wyatt is a defense attorney who specializes in financial forensics and identity theft. I attached the forged deed, the Shadowlender contract, and the screenshots of their midnight texts. My instructions to him were brief. I told him my family had just pledged my land to a private syndicate, and I needed to know the exact moment the trap would snap shut on their fingers. Wyatt called me as soon as his office opened. His advice was cold, precise, and exactly what I needed to hear. He told me that if we froze the accounts right that second, it would only be classified as attempted fraud. My parents could spin a story about a misunderstanding. They could claim the power of attorney was used by mistake. The local police might even dismiss it as a civil family dispute. But if we waited just a few days, if we let the syndicate disperse the funds into an account my parents controlled, and if Tara spent even $1 of that money across state lines, the narrative would change permanently. It would elevate from a local family argument into federal wire fraud. I sat on my porch listening to the morning birds and embraced the arithmetic of justice. I was not dealing with family anymore. I was dealing with thieves who knew the layout of my house. They thought my silence that morning meant I was compliant. They thought their text messages had successfully bullied me into submission. They had no idea I was sitting in the Ozarks, drinking black coffee, and quietly drafting the blueprints for their prison cells. I put my phone on airplane mode. Let them think they won the morning. I had a lot of work to do before Sunday dinner. I left my cabin an hour after the sun came up. I did not drive toward the county sheriff's office or the local bank branch. I pointed my truck north toward the property line. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through steep limestone bluffs and dense switchbacks that most tourists avoid. The morning mist was still clinging to the valley floor, turning the dense forest into a sea of gray and dark green. The 50 acres of timberland sat in a protected basin. My grandfather bought that parcel during an economic downturn, using decades of saved wages from working double shifts at the local sawmill. He held on to it when everyone else sold out. He spent his weekends walking those ridges, teaching me how to identify invasive beetles, how to read the health of the soil by its color, and how to respect a forest that would outlive us both. He left the deed solely to me because he knew my father viewed nature as nothing more than a giant green automated teller machine. Hank had spent his entire adult life looking for shortcuts. He chased quick investments, flipped broken-down properties with cheap materials, and accumulated hidden debts while trying to maintain the illusion of a wealthy local businessman. My grandfather knew Hank would pave over paradise for a quick payout without a second thought. So he bypassed the generational chain and handed the keys directly to me, ensuring the sanctuary would remain untouched. When I arrived at the primary access road, I shifted my truck into park and left the engine running. A rusted iron gate stretched across the gravel path, meant to keep out poachers and illegal dumpers. I walked up to the heavy steel chain. It was hanging loose, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. The heavy-duty master lock I had installed 3 years ago was lying in the damp dirt. It had been sliced clean through. The shiny, jagged edges of the metal indicated heavy bolt cutters. It was a fresh cut, untouched by the recent mountain rain, the brass core gleaming in the early light. I crouched down and examined the ground. Beside the severed lock were fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the mud. The treads were wide, indicating a heavy, commercial-sized sport utility vehicle. These tracks did not belong to my father's standard pickup truck. I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs. I documented the sliced lock, the broken chain, the tire treads, and the specific direction they traveled into my property. This discovery shifted the reality of the situation. This was no longer just a digital crime executed from the comfort of a living room laptop. This was a premeditated physical trespass. They had come onto my land, broken my gate, and invited strangers in to steal it from under my feet. The low rumble of an approaching engine broke the silence of the woods. A weathered four-wheeler rolled down the adjacent property line, driven by Silas. Silas was an older neighboring landowner who had known my family since I was a child in pigtails. He cut his engine, tipped his faded canvas cap, and leaned over his handlebars. He mentioned he was glad to finally see me out here checking on things. I asked him what he meant by that. Silas casually explained that he had seen Hank out by the eastern ridge late last Thursday afternoon. According to Silas, my father had brought 3 men in expensive suits driving a black luxury vehicle onto the property. Silas watched them from a distance while mending his fence. The men were walking the boundary lines, pointing at the timber density and taking extensive notes on clipboards. Silas chuckled, shaking his head. He said those men looked like they had never stepped off pavement in their lives, ruining their expensive dress shoes in the Ozark mud. He assumed I was finally listening to my father and selling off the timber rights to a commercial developer. He told me Hank was walking around acting like he owned every blade of grass, shaking hands with the city suits and pointing out the best spots to clear-cut the pines. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I offered Silas a polite smile, thanked him for keeping an eye on the place, and told him we were just getting some standard land appraisals done for tax purposes. I waited until Silas restarted his engine and rode out of sight. Once the sound of his four-wheeler faded into the trees, the cold realization settled over me. Those men in suits were not developers. They were predatory shadow lender appraisers. Hank had brought them onto my property illegally to underwrite the $350,000 loan. He had cut my lock, escorted them through my grandfather's sanctuary, and played the role of the rightful owner while the real owner was 50 miles away plotting soil charts. I walked back to the cab of my truck, rolled up the windows, and dialed Wyatt Sterling again. Wyatt answered on the second ring. I described the severed padlock, the tire tracks, and the witness testimony from Silas. I told Wyatt I wanted to call the state troopers, report the breaking and entering, and shut down the loan disbursement right that second. My chest felt tight. The urge to confront my father, to drive to his house, and throw the severed lock through his front window was burning in the back of my throat. Wyatt told me to take a breath. His voice was calm, measured, and stripped of all emotion. He reminded me that the law does not reward impatience. Wyatt explained the legal mechanics of our situation with surgical precision. If I called the local authorities and froze the accounts today, the syndicate would simply cancel the pending loan. Hank would likely face a minor trespassing charge and a slap on the wrist for attempted identity theft in a county court. A local judge might even dismiss it as a civil family dispute over property management. The system often protects fathers who claim they were just trying to help their daughters manage complex assets. But Wyatt continued, if we exercise strategic patience, the board changes entirely. The shadow lenders are based in Little Rock, but the corporate accounts they use to disperse funds are routed through out-of-state holding companies. Tara has already signed non-refundable contracts for her glamping business with suppliers located in Texas and Tennessee. If we wait for the syndicate to clear the hard money loan, and we allow Tara to transfer that stolen money across state lines to purchase her luxury tents and equipment, the crime graduates. It crosses state jurisdictions. It transforms from a local misdemeanor into a federal wire fraud case with undeniable, documented physical evidence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would have jurisdiction, not a sympathetic local sheriff who goes to the same church as my mother. I sat in the silence of my truck, staring out through the windshield at the towering pines. The choice was between a quick, unsatisfying scolding or a total, unmitigated dismantling of the people who thought they could treat my life like a withdrawal slip. I chose the latter. I decided to embrace the cold arithmetic of justice. I would give them the exact amount of rope they needed to weave their own downfall. I would let them build their own prison, dollar by stolen dollar. I put my truck into gear and drove back toward the main highway. My plan required me to play a role I had perfected over 3 decades: the quiet, compliant, unbothered daughter. I needed to look them in the eye and pretend the ground beneath us was stable, even while I knew the structural integrity of their lies was about to give way. As I reached the paved road, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. A new message illuminated the screen. It was my mother, Brenda. She told me to meet her and Hank at the local community diner in an hour. She said they were ordering my favorite breakfast and wanted to catch up. She added a smiley face icon at the end of the text. The architect of my ruin was inviting me to eat biscuits and gravy while her signature dried on my stolen deed. I checked my rearview mirror one last time, hit the turn signal, and headed toward town to face them. The bell above the door of the Hickory Spoon chimed, announcing my arrival. The diner smelled of bacon grease, burnt sugar, and strong black coffee. It was the epicenter of our small town, a place where reputations were built and destroyed over ceramic mugs. I spotted my parents immediately. They had claimed the large center booth, the one positioned perfectly to see and be seen by everyone walking through the door. My mother, Brenda, was wearing a crisp floral blouse with her hair styled into a stiff blonde helmet. She was leaning over the table laughing at a joke told by the mayor's wife in the adjacent booth. My father, Hank, sat beside her in a pressed button-down shirt, looking every bit the successful local businessman. They did not look like people who had just pledged their daughter's 50-acre inheritance to a shadow banking syndicate. They looked like pillars of the community. I walked over my mud-caked work boots thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. I slid into the vinyl seat across from them. Before I even had a chance to speak, a waitress dropped a steaming plate of biscuits and sausage gravy in front of me. Brenda smiled her sweetest, most practiced smile. She pushed a glass of iced tea toward my side of the table and told me I was working far too hard out in those woods. She said I needed a hot meal and some family time. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and set it face down on the Formica table next to my tea. The voice memo application was already running. Arkansas is a one-party consent state for audio recording. I did not need their permission to document their lies. Hank cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to adopt an authoritative tone. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table, tapping the bottom corner with his index finger. It was a final disbursement waiver. The Little Rock Syndicate had approved the initial commercial loan, but they required one last wet signature from the guarantor to release the remaining reserve funds into the Fletcher Eco Glamping corporate account. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He said the bank just needed a minor formality signed to finalize Tara's business account. He acted as if he was asking me to co-sign a library card. I did not touch the paper. I looked at Brenda. The sweet facade slipped just a fraction, revealing the sharp, calculating matriarch beneath. She reached out and patted my hand. Her skin was cold. She launched into a rehearsed monologue about family duty. Tara had experienced a run of bad luck, Brenda explained. My younger sister had burned through 3 separate multi-level marketing ventures in 4 years. She tried selling imported leggings, infused diet shakes, and scented essential oils. Each venture ended in quiet bankruptcy, which Hank and Brenda secretly covered up. Now Tara had allegedly found her true calling. She was going to be the chief executive officer of a luxury glamping resort. Brenda looked me right in the eye and delivered the guilt trip she had been polishing for decades. She told me that I already had a stable career in forestry. I had my quiet life in the cabin. She said family wealth is communal, and the Fletcher legacy was meant to elevate all of us, not just the daughter who decided to hoard dirt and trees. Tara needed a win, and my pristine credit score was the only way to facilitate it. I sat there listening to my mother justify grand theft as a charitable donation. Brenda turned her head to wave cheerfully at Pastor Miller, who was walking out the front door. She projected the image of a devout, loving mother. Watching her wave to the pastor, I remembered a long afternoon walking the timber tracks with my grandfather. I was 12 years old. He stopped in front of a towering, majestic white oak tree. The canopy was thick with green leaves. The bark looked unblemished and strong. My grandfather pulled a small hand axe from his belt and tapped the blunt end against the trunk. The wood did not produce a solid thud. It rang with a strange, hollow echo. He told me the tree had heart rot. It is a fungal disease that attacks the center of the trunk. The fungus eats away the core wood, turning the inside to useless mush, while the outside layers continue to transport water and pretend everything is fine. A tree with heart rot looks perfect to the untrained eye, right up until a strong gust of wind snaps it in half. Looking across the table at Brenda, I realized my mother was a walking white oak with heart rot. She maintained a flawless exterior for the church congregation and the town council, but inside, her moral center had rotted away decades ago. She would sacrifice my future without a second thought, just to keep up appearances and shield her favorite child from reality. I needed them to speak plainly. Wyatt required undeniable proof of their intent. I picked up the final disbursement waiver, pretending to study the dense legal text. I furrowed my brow to feign confusion. I told Hank the underwriting process did not make sense. The financial power of attorney they possessed was nearly 10 years old. The signature protocol for commercial real estate liens requires a recent verified notary seal. I asked my father how he managed to get the Shadow Syndicate to accept the expired document without me present in the room. Hank could never resist an opportunity to show off his own perceived brilliance. He smiled a smug expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He leaned over his plate of eggs and explained his clever workaround. He bragged that he called in a favor from his old friend Gary at the county title office. Hank confessed that Gary used a backdated notary stamp, altering the official ledger to make it appear as though I had recently authorized the commercial lien in person. He said it with pride. My father sat in a crowded diner eating breakfast and proudly confessed to conspiring to commit federal bank fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. He thought he was explaining a savvy business maneuver to his naive daughter. The digital timer on my phone screen silently ticked past the 7-minute mark. I had everything Wyatt needed. The trap was fully constructed, and my parents had just eagerly handed me the keys to lock the door. I folded the waiver neatly into thirds and slipped it into the breast pocket of my work jacket. I told Hank I needed to review the fine print at home before I signed anything. Brenda let out a soft, relieved sigh. She interpreted my calm demeanor as submission. She truly believed her guilt trip had worked and that the unbothered, compliant daughter was falling right back into her assigned role. I slid out of the booth. Hank offered to pay for my breakfast, reaching for his wallet to play the generous patriarch. I declined. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my pocket and set it directly on top of the receipt. I never let them pay for my meals. Financial independence was the only shield I had ever known in that family, and I was not going to drop it now. I told them I would be in touch. I turned my back on their satisfied smiles and walked out the glass doors into the bright Ozark morning. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs, washing away the scent of bacon grease and stale lies. I climbed into the cab of my truck, retrieved my phone, and stopped the recording. I immediately uploaded the audio file to the secure cloud folder I shared with Wyatt. I had survived the ambush. I possessed the recorded felony confession. I left them sitting in the diner with the illusion of total control. They thought they had secured their $350,000 prize. They did not realize they had just funded their own destruction. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. Before I reached the highway on-ramp, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a notification from a social media application. Tara had just tagged me in a new public post. The first round of the stolen loan money had officially cleared the bank, and the golden child was about to start spending it loudly. I kept my eyes on the road, knowing her delusion was about to provide the final nail in their coffin. I pulled my work truck onto the gravel driveway of my cabin and shifted into park. The engine ticked as it cooled beneath the hood. I stared at the notification illuminating my phone screen. Tara had tagged me in a public social media post. I opened the application, bracing myself for the spectacle. A barrage of high-resolution photographs flooded my feed. The centerpiece was an image of Tara standing proudly in front of a heavy-duty lifted pickup truck. The vehicle was painted a blinding metallic pearl. The custom chrome grille gleamed under the bright dealership lights. Tara was posing with one hand resting on the oversized tire. She wore pristine suede boots that had never touched actual Ozark topsoil, and a designer felt hat tilted perfectly for the camera angle. The caption beneath the photo read, "Big moves require big rides. Officially, the boss thanks to my amazing family for the support." She appended a long string of hashtags, concluding the post with Ozark CEO and self-made. I recognized the dealership logo displayed proudly on the banner behind her. The business was located in Springfield, Missouri. She had crossed the state line to make the purchase. By acquiring a luxury vehicle out of state using the hard money loan funds she had just transformed a localized document forgery into an interstate financial crime. The truck she selected was a highly customized model. The sticker price for that specific trim package hovered around $75,000. She had not laid a single foundation pad for a glamping tent, nor had she pulled a single land permit. Yet she had purchased a vehicle designed for hauling heavy construction equipment, just to drive to the local coffee shop. My own vehicle sat beneath a nearby oak tree. It was a 9-year-old Ford with a dented quarter panel and a truck bed filled with soil sampling tools, safety harnesses, and rusted logging chains. I earned every scratch on that paint through grueling physical labor, dragging the chassis up washed-out dirt roads in the pouring rain. Tara preferred the aesthetics of hard work without ever breaking a sweat. She wanted the prestigious title of a rugged entrepreneur without building the calluses required to earn it. Growing up, while I spent my summers pulling weeds in the suffocating heat to earn allowance money, she sat inside, complaining about the humidity until my father handed her a $20 bill just to quiet the complaining. That dynamic had never shifted. It had only grown exponentially more expensive. A second post appeared on my feed 2 hours later. This update featured a video of Tara sitting across a polished glass desk from a corporate sales representative. She held a silver pen, dramatically signing her name across a stack of thick legal documents. The location tag identified a luxury outdoor recreation supplier based in Nashville, Tennessee. She was finalizing a non-refundable purchase agreement for 5 custom-manufactured eco-domes. These elaborate structures featured panoramic skylights, heated floors, and imported waterproof canvas. The caption boasted about securing the ultimate luxury wilderness experience for her future high-end guests. The dramatic irony of the situation tasted sharp and metallic in my mouth. Tara genuinely thought she was curating an enviable lifestyle brand for her followers. She believed she was documenting her brilliant rise to entrepreneurial prominence. In reality, she was meticulously curating a digital portfolio of her own federal wire fraud. Every photograph contained a hidden digital timestamp. Every location tag provided exact geographic coordinates for the authorities. She was doing the investigative legwork for the federal government, wrapping her crimes in a neat, filtered, aesthetically pleasing bow. I did not feel anger watching her squander the stolen funds. I felt the cold, detached satisfaction of a predator watching a snare pull tight. My phone vibrated against my calloused palm. A direct text message arrived from Tara. The tone was characteristically demanding, cloaked in a thin layer of fake sisterly affection. The text read, "Hey sis, the business accounts are live. I need you to swing by the house tonight and set up the QuickBooks software for me. Since your name is technically on the guarantor line, you should probably handle the bookkeeping so everything stays organized. Bring your laptop." The sheer entitlement radiated from the glowing screen. She had hijacked my inheritance to fund a vanity project, and now she expected me to provide free accounting labor to manage the stolen ledger. For my entire life, I had been treated as the family utility closet. I was the reliable invisible daughter they called when a computer crashed, a tax form needed filing, or a logistical problem required untangling. They confused my quiet competence with subservience. They assumed my boundaries were forever negotiable as long as they framed their unreasonable demands as a simple family favor. I did not reply to her demand. I took a clear screenshot of the text message. I compiled the image of the Missouri truck purchase, the video of the Tennessee Ecodome contract, and the bookkeeping request into a new encrypted file folder. I logged into a secure client portal and transmitted the entire evidence package to Brody Lawson. Brody was a private financial investigator Wyatt Sterling kept on a permanent retainer. He spent 15 years working as a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice before opening his own independent firm. Brody possessed a unique, terrifying talent for following digital money trails through complex corporate shells. He did not care about family drama, Southern hospitality, or emotional manipulation. He only cared about banking ledgers, routing numbers, and undeniable proof of criminal intent. 5 minutes after I uploaded the files, Brody sent a brief, secure reply. He confirmed that the initial funds from the Shadow Syndicate had hit the Fletcher Eco Glamping account that morning. The balance was already hemorrhaging at a spectacular rate. He noted the truck purchase had been executed as a direct wire transfer, pulling $75,000 straight from the principal loan amount. The Ecodome deposit drained another $40,000. Over $100,000 of the borrowed capital had vanished in less than 6 hours, spent entirely on depreciating assets and non-refundable vendor deposits, before a single blueprint had been drafted. I sat back in my desk chair, watching the numbers align on my computer monitor. The trap was no longer theoretical. By executing those interstate wire transfers, Tara had crossed the legal threshold. There was no retreating for any of them. If my father tried to claim the notary forgery was just a misunderstanding, the immediate, reckless depletion of the funds would prove undeniable malicious intent. The Shadow Syndicate would not care about my father's apologies or my mother's church reputation. They would only care about recovering the missing capital. I closed the laptop lid, sealing the glowing screen away in the dark. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, pregnant with anticipation. The initial rush of the spending spree was over. The hard money was bleeding out at an unsustainable rate. Soon the glamping account would require the final reserve disbursement to stay afloat. That final disbursement hinged entirely on the waiver currently sitting folded in the pocket of my work jacket. My parents were waiting for my signature. When the weekend passed and I remained silent, their polite Southern hospitality would inevitably evaporate. They would realize their compliant daughter was not falling into her assigned role. Brenda was not a woman who tolerated defiance. If she could not manipulate me in private, I knew she would try to destroy me in public. The battle was about to shift from a digital ledger to the very streets of our small town. The weekend passed in a heavy, deliberate silence. My phone accumulated unread messages and unanswered voicemails from my parents. I ignored every single one. The final disbursement waiver remained folded inside my jacket pocket, unsigned and useless. In a tight-knit Ozark community, prolonged silence is rarely interpreted as a need for privacy. It is perceived as a direct challenge. Brenda Fletcher did not tolerate disobedience. Her self-worth hinged on her ability to puppet the lives of everyone sharing her last name. When she realized I was not rushing to my sister's side to provide free accounting labor, the sweet Southern matriarch act evaporated. She swiftly pivoted to a warfare tactic she had perfected over decades. She weaponized the town. My mother held a powerful position within the local social hierarchy. She chaired the church hospitality committee, organized the annual harvest festival, and baked casseroles for every grieving widow in the county. She used those casseroles as currency to purchase unwavering loyalty. If Brenda needed to destroy a reputation, she never raised her voice or hurled insults. She disguised her character assassinations as heartfelt prayer requests. She had done it years ago to a neighbor who contested my father's property line, whispering about the poor man's alleged drinking problem until the town isolated him. Now she was aiming that same invisible artillery at her own daughter. The first tremor of her social strike reached me on a rainy Wednesday morning. I drove my work truck into town to resupply my inventory. I needed neon surveyor tape, marking paint, and waterproof boots from the local forestry outfitter. The bell above the shop door chimed its familiar greeting. Elias, the owner, usually met me with a booming laugh and a joke about the unpredictable mountain weather. We had conducted business together for 7 years. Today, the store felt suffocating. Elias stood behind the wooden counter, meticulously wiping down the glass display case with a rag. He did not look up when I approached. I set my items on the counter. Elias rang them up in an uncomfortable quiet. When he handed me the receipt, his eyes finally met mine. His expression made my chest tighten. It was a look of profound, patronizing pity. He leaned forward, resting his weathered hands on the counter, and lowered his voice to a hushed whisper. He asked if I was holding up okay out there in the woods all alone. Before I could formulate a response, he reached under the register and slid a glossy business card across the counter. It was the contact information for a licensed behavioral therapist located 2 towns over. Elias said there was no shame in asking for help when the isolation becomes too much to bear. I stared at the card. I kept my breathing steady. I asked Elias what prompted him to hand me a therapist's contact information. He shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck in obvious discomfort. He confessed that my mother had stood up during the community announcements after Sunday service. Brenda had requested a special prayer circle for her eldest daughter. She stood before the entire congregation, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and spun a tragic narrative. She told the town I was suffering from a severe, stress-induced mental breakdown. She claimed my demanding forestry job had fractured my grip on reality, turning me into a paranoid, overworked spinster. To make the lie bulletproof, Brenda added a final, devastating detail. She told the congregation that my behavior had become so erratic, my father was forced to step in and assume legal control of my finances for my own protection. The true nature of her strategy clicked into place. This was not merely a temper tantrum over an unsigned waiver. This was a calculated inoculation strategy. Brenda knew that eventually the Shadow Syndicate loan would default, or I would report the forgery to the authorities. She was salting the earth ahead of my testimony. By planting the seed of my alleged mental incompetence throughout the town, she was ensuring that when I finally spoke the truth, no one would believe me. The local sheriff, the bank tellers, and our neighbors would view my federal fraud allegations as the hysterical ramblings of a sick woman lashing out at the loving parents who were only trying to manage her assets. She was building a psychological prison to trap me inside my own hijacked identity. I did not argue with Elias. Defending my sanity to a man who had already consumed my mother's poison would only make me look defensive. I offered a tight, polite smile, thanked him for his concern, and slid the business card into my pocket. I picked up my supplies and walked out the door. The moment I climbed into my truck, the path forward became crystal clear. I could not fight a ghost in the court of public opinion. I needed to secure the one domain where my mother's casseroles held no power: my career. I drove straight to the regional headquarters of the forestry consulting firm. My regional director, Harrison, was a pragmatic man who valued hard data and unvarnished truth. He did not attend my mother's church, and he did not care about local gossip. I knocked on his office door and asked for 10 minutes of his time. I sat across from his desk and laid out the situation with the precision of a surgeon. I did not shed a single tear. I did not complain about my childhood or my sister's entitlement. I presented him with a summarized timeline. I informed him that my identity and property had been compromised in a sophisticated financial forgery involving a private lending syndicate. I told him I was working closely with legal counsel and a private investigator to resolve the matter. Harrison listened intently, steepling his fingers. I then explained the secondary threat. I told him the perpetrators of the fraud were currently attempting to discredit my professional and mental stability within the community to mask their crimes. I wanted to give him a factual heads up in case any of those rumors reached the corporate office or in case someone called the firm attempting to interfere with my employment status. Harrison appreciated the proactive transparency. He had reviewed my quarterly soil density reports just that morning and noted my output was flawless. He assured me my professional standing was secure and offered to run any suspicious external inquiries directly through the legal department. I walked out of the regional office feeling an immense weight lift from my shoulders. Brenda thought she could isolate me by burning my social bridges. She failed to realize my fortress was built on competence, not popularity. By neutralizing her whisper campaign, I stripped away my parents' final layer of psychological leverage. They could no longer shame me into submission. The weekend was approaching, and the glamping account was rapidly running out of liquid capital. Tara needed the remaining loan funds to pay the contractors, and the Shadow Syndicate would not release the money without my final signature. My unbothered defiance was driving them into a corner. When manipulative people run out of lies, they usually resort to brute force. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I walked to my truck. It was a text from an unknown number stating they knew exactly which remote trailhead I was surveying tomorrow morning. The psychological warfare had failed, and the physical intimidation was about to begin. The dawn air up on Blackwood Ridge carried a sharp chill that settled deep into your bones. I parked my work truck near the edge of the tree line, grabbed my soil auger from the bed, and hiked a mile into the dense federal forestry sector. The text message from the unknown number the previous night had promised a visit. I knew exactly who it was, and I chose this specific location on purpose. This tract of land was under strict government protection, monitored for illegal logging and poaching. It was my home turf. I drove the steel core of the auger into the damp earth, twisting the handle to extract a cross-section of the soil. The physical labor grounded me. The scent of decaying pine needles and wet limestone filled my lungs. I cataloged the soil horizons in my field notebook, enjoying the profound silence of the mountain morning. The silence shattered roughly 40 minutes later. The distinct, out-of-place sound of expensive street tires spinning on loose gravel echoed through the valley. Through the breaks in the timber, I watched a sleek, blacked-out luxury sport utility vehicle bounce up the unpaved fire road. The suspension was taking a beating it was never designed to handle. The vehicle jerked to a halt a few yards from my truck. The driver door swung open. Trent stepped out into the mud. Trent was Tara's fiancé. He was a man who navigated life relying entirely on hair product and unearned confidence. He spent his 20s bouncing between failed cryptocurrency startups and vague consulting gigs, always searching for a shortcut to wealth without ever breaking a sweat. He wore designer loafers that immediately sank an inch into the Ozark topsoil. His tight slacks and thin windbreaker offered no protection against the mountain chill. He smelled of synthetic cologne, a sharp chemical odor that overpowered the natural scent of the forest. He did not look like a man preparing to manage a rustic outdoor glamping resort. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched. I did not stop my work. I tapped the dirt from the auger, wiped the steel blade with a rag, and waited for him to navigate the uneven terrain. He stumbled over an exposed root, cursing under his breath before marching directly toward me. He closed the distance fast, invading my personal space. He stopped barely an arm's length away, trying to use his height to cast a shadow over me. It is a classic intimidation tactic used by men who mistake physical proximity for actual power. He pointed a manicured finger at my chest. He did not bother with a greeting. He demanded to know what my problem was. His voice echoed off the trees, shrill and frantic. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a duplicate copy of the final disbursement waiver. My father must have printed a fresh stack after I walked out of the diner. Trent shoved the paper toward my face. He told me the game was over. He said the accounts were locked pending the final signature, and the contractors were threatening to walk away from the Ecodome project by noon. He ordered me to sign the document immediately so the bank would release the remaining reserve capital. I looked at the crumpled paper, then up at his bloodshot eyes. I told him he was trespassing on an active federal survey site. Trent let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He took another step forward, forcing me to plant my boots firmly into the dirt to hold my ground. He lowered his voice, adopting a menacing tone he likely practiced in a bathroom mirror. He told me I was making a terrible mistake. He leaned in and informed me that my mother had already laid the groundwork in town. He threatened to amplify Brenda's narrative. He promised to make personal phone calls to my regional director, the county board, and every local business owner in the valley. He swore he would convince the entire Ozark community that I was a dangerous, unstable liability. He said he would not stop until I lost my job, my reputation, and my cabin. He guaranteed I would be run out of the state if I did not release that money today. He was breathing heavy. A bead of sweat dripped down his temple despite the cold air. I did not flinch. I work in a wilderness populated by black bears, feral hogs, and unpredictable weather systems. A desperate man in ruined designer loafers did not register on my threat scale. I kept my hands resting loosely on the handle of my soil auger. I shifted my gaze from his face to a thick, ancient pine tree positioned roughly 10 yards behind his right shoulder. I tilted my head and offered him a polite, chilling smile. I advised him to turn around very slowly and look at the bark on that trunk. Trent frowned, his false bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced over his shoulder. Strapped halfway up the pine tree, blending perfectly with the rough brown bark, was a high-definition trail camera. The small, dark glass lens was aimed directly at us. A tiny red light blinked steadily in the center of the device. I explained the mechanics of the hardware to him. I told him it was a motion-activated military-grade recording device used by the Federal Forestry Department to monitor poachers. I informed him that the camera was currently capturing his face, his vehicle, and his threatening gestures in crystal-clear 4,000-pixel resolution. I added that the device was not storing the footage locally on a memory card. It was actively transmitting a live cellular uplink directly to a secure cloud server monitored by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I let that information settle into his panicked brain. Then I outlined the legal reality of his situation. I told him that threatening a federal contractor while she is operating on protected government land is not a simple misdemeanor. It is a federal offense. I asked him if he thought the local sheriff could protect him from a federal indictment, or if he believed his designer clothes would serve him well in a federal holding facility. The blood drained from Trent's face so fast, he looked practically translucent. The menacing posture evaporated. He took a rapid step backward, nearly tripping over the same exposed root. He stared at the blinking red light on the trail camera with wide, terrified eyes. He did not say another word. He turned and scrambled back toward his luxury vehicle. I watched him yank the driver door open, throw the vehicle into gear, and speed back down the fire road. The tires spun wildly, kicking up a shower of mud and gravel as he fled the scene. The roar of the engine faded, leaving the mountain quiet once again. I picked up my field notebook and jotted down the final soil metric. On the surface, the encounter was a victory. I had successfully neutralized the intimidation tactic. But as I packed my equipment into the bed of my truck, the details of Trent's frantic behavior began to gnaw at the edge of my mind. His desperation was disproportionate to the situation. A man does not risk federal charges and physical confrontation simply because his fiancée's vanity project is facing a temporary cash flow issue. A fake glamping resort can be delayed. A legitimate business owner handles bank disputes through attorneys and accountants, not by ambushing a family member in the woods. Trent was not acting like an entrepreneur eager to start a new venture. He was acting like a man who owed money to dangerous people. He had looked at me with genuine terror in his eyes when he mentioned the delayed reserve funds. He did not say Tara needed the money. He said he needed the money today. The puzzle pieces shifted, revealing a much darker picture. Tara's sudden interest in outdoor hospitality never made sense. She hated the woods. Trent's involvement made even less sense. He was a creature of the city, addicted to easy cash and superficial status. The Fletcher Eco Glamping LLC was not a dream. It was a shield. I climbed into the cab of my truck and locked the doors. I turned on the engine, connected my phone to the dashboard display, and dialed Brody Lawson. The private investigator answered with his usual gruff efficiency. I told Brody to drop everything he was currently working on. I instructed him to tear open the corporate veil of the Fletcher Eco-Glamping Limited Liability Company. I wanted to know the exact names listed on the incorporation documents. I needed to see the routing numbers for the initial vendor deposits. Most importantly, I told Brody to run a comprehensive background check on Trent, focusing entirely on hidden debts, outstanding civil judgments, and any connections to unregulated gambling or shadow banking syndicates in the Little Rock area. The loan was never meant to buy luxury tents. The $75,000 truck Tara paraded on social media was likely a smokescreen, a loud distraction designed to make the business look legitimate, while the rest of the capital was funneled somewhere else. I shifted the truck into drive and began the descent back towards civilization. The true motive behind the forgery was hiding in those corporate filings. My parents had sacrificed my inheritance, but I was suddenly certain they had not done it to buy Tara a fresh start. They had done it to pay off a ransom. The game was escalating from identity theft into organized crime, and I was going to follow the money straight to the source. I locked the heavy deadbolt on my cabin door and threw my keys onto the kitchen counter. The encounter in the woods had shifted the temperature of the entire situation. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, carried a steaming mug to my drafting desk, and woke up my laptop. I initiated a secure video conference line. Wyatt joined the call first, sitting in his sterile downtown office with a dark suit and a grim expression. A moment later, Brody Lawson appeared on the screen. The private investigator looked like he had not slept in a week. He sat in a dim room, illuminated only by the glow of multiple computer monitors. Brody did not waste time with pleasantries. He shared his screen, bringing up a complex web of financial flowcharts and corporate registration documents. He told me the entire narrative my parents had spun was a meticulously constructed lie. The Fletcher Eco-Glamping Limited Liability Company was not a fledgling outdoor hospitality venture. It was a hastily assembled financial shield. Brody pulled up the incorporation paperwork. The business had been registered with the state a mere 48 hours before the shadow syndicate approved the hard money loan. Tara was listed as the chief executive officer, but the registered agent was a blank shell corporation operating out of a strip mall in Delaware. I asked Brody about the vendor deposits. I wanted to know where the initial $100,000 had vanished. He clicked on a new tab displaying the routing numbers for the wire transfers Tara had executed earlier that week. The $40,000 deposit for the luxury eco-domes did not go to a legitimate manufacturer in Tennessee. Brody had traced the recipient account. The vendor was a phantom corporation. It possessed no manufacturing facility, no warehouse, and no physical inventory. The corporate mailing address matched a vacant storefront in a dilapidated sector of Little Rock. That vacant storefront was a known front for an underground sports betting syndicate. My father had always chased the thrill of a quick payout. Growing up, Hank frequently disappeared on weekend business trips that always seemed to coincide with major sporting events. He claimed he was networking with regional timber buyers in Tunica or hosting prospective clients at casino steakhouses. In reality, he was feeding a crippling gambling addiction. He cultivated the image of a fearless high roller, tossing $100 bills onto card tables to impress strangers. But his true poison was offshore sports books and unregulated local bookies. He bet on everything from collegiate football to amateur boxing, convinced his next wager would erase his mounting losses. Brody presented the final piece of the financial puzzle. He had accessed a shadow ledger through an informant within the State Gaming Commission. Hank did not just owe a few $1,000s to a friendly neighborhood bookmaker. My father was buried beneath a $200,000 deficit. The syndicate had grown tired of his empty promises and bounced checks. They demanded immediate payment, and they dictated the exact method of extraction. The shadow lender that approved the loan was a subsidiary of the very same betting syndicate. They had orchestrated the commercial lien to force Hank to liquidate his only remaining collateral. When my father realized his own assets were leveraged to the breaking point, he offered up my 50-acre inheritance to save his kneecaps. I stared at the flowchart on my screen. The chilling reality of Trent's involvement suddenly crystallized. Trent was never a legitimate fiancé. He had not met Tara by chance at a local coffee shop. Trent was a debt collector. He was a bagman, dispatched by the Little Rock bookies to insert himself into the Fletcher family dynamic. He targeted Tara because she was gullible, desperate for attention, and positioned perfectly close to Hank's assets. Trent courted my sister, fed her delusions of becoming a wealthy entrepreneur, and guided my parents through the process of establishing the money laundering front. The vehicle purchase made perfect sense now. The $75,000 custom truck Tara flaunted on social media was a prop. It was a loud, shiny distraction designed to make the business appear legitimate to local bank tellers, while the remaining loan capital was quietly funneled to pay off Hank's gambling markers. Tara was oblivious. My sister genuinely believed she was a self-made businesswoman. She was typing hashtags and picking out waterproof canvas while acting as a human shield for organized crime. I sat in the quiet of my cabin, letting the magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. The emotional devastation was profound. My parents had not sacrificed my future to build my sister's dream. They had sacrificed my grandfather's legacy to cover my father's vices. They framed the theft as a noble familial duty because asking a daughter to pay off an illegal sports betting debt was too shameful for their curated Southern image. Brenda had orchestrated a town-wide whisper campaign about my mental health to protect a degenerate gambler. The stakes had escalated far beyond a domestic property dispute. This was a dangerous entanglement with a criminal syndicate. If I signed the final disbursement waiver, the bookies would receive their final payment, my father would walk away clean, and I would spend the rest of my life paying off a predatory loan or forfeit my land to a cartel. If I refused to sign, the syndicate would turn their attention back to Hank. Trent's frantic behavior in the woods was the reaction of a low-level operative terrified of failing his violent employers. The final reserve capital was due, and the bagman was running out of time. Wyatt broke the silence on the conference call. He advised me that the introduction of organized crime changed our strategy. We could no longer afford to play games with the local authorities. He stated we needed to bypass the county sheriff entirely and hand the dossier directly to federal investigators. The wire fraud, the money laundering, and the extortion fell firmly under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I agreed with Wyatt. The cold arithmetic of justice required a heavier hand. I told Brody to prepare the final evidence package. I was ready to drop the federal hammer on the entire operation. Before we disconnected the call, I asked Brody to send me the original scanned file of the forged notary document. Something about the narrative felt incomplete. If Hank was terrified of the syndicate, his self-preservation instincts would have pushed him to distance himself from the actual felony. Hank was a coward. Cowards rarely wield the knife themselves. Brody transmitted the high-resolution image of the lending agreement. I opened the file on my monitor and zoomed in on the signature line. I stared at the heavy-handed loop on the capital letter Z. I had assumed it was my father's handwriting, but as I studied the ink pressure and the angle of the cursive strokes, a cold realization crept up the back of my neck. I needed to cross-reference that specific loop with an old family recipe card sitting in my kitchen drawer. The true architect of this fraud had been hiding in plain sight, and the revelation was about to shatter the last remaining illusion of my childhood. I kept the high-resolution image of the lending agreement open on my computer monitor. The digital document glowed against the dark backdrop of my cabin living room. The cursor hovered directly over the guarantor's signature line. I stared at the heavy-handed loop on the capital letter Z that began my first name. For days, I had operated under the assumption that my father executed the forgery. Hank was the one drowning in a $200,000 deficit to an underground sports betting syndicate. Hank was the one who brought the shadow lender appraisers onto my timberland. It made logical sense that Hank would be the one to press the pen to the paper and sign my inheritance away. But logic often fails when applied to cowards. My father possessed a loud, boastful personality, but he lacked the stomach for genuine risk. He was a man who placed reckless bets only when he believed he could avoid the consequences. When the Little Rock bookies finally cornered him, demanding immediate payment and sending a bagman named Trent to threaten his physical safety, Hank would have panicked. he would not have possessed the steady hand required to execute a flawless binding legal forgery. His nerves would have shattered. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked into my small kitchen. I opened the top drawer beside the stove and pulled out a weathered wooden recipe box. It was a gift from my grandmother, filled with faded index cards detailing decades of traditional Ozark Mountain cooking. I flipped through the tab dividers until I found the dessert section. I pulled out a stained pink index card containing the instructions for a blackberry cobbler. The recipe was written in blue ink. The handwriting did not belong to my grandmother. It belonged to my mother. Brenda had transcribed the card for me when I moved into the cabin 5 years ago. I carried the pink index card back to my drafting desk and held it up right next to the glowing monitor. I focused on the ingredient list, specifically the line requesting the zest of 1 lemon. I looked at the capital letter Z on the recipe card. Then I looked at the capital letter Z on the commercial hard money loan agreement. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The strokes were identical. The heavy-handed loop did not belong to a lumberman accustomed to signing manifests. It belonged to a woman who spent her entire adult life meticulously controlling the narrative of her household. It was the exact same cursive slant Brenda used to fill out the Sunday school name tags. It was the same authoritative pressure she applied when writing out checks for the church hospitality committee. My mother forged the document. The ultimate red herring evaporated into the cold mountain air. Sweet, church-going Brenda was the true architect of the fraud. My mother had spent 30 years cultivating a flawless, matriarchal image within our small town. She thrived on the respect of the congregation and the envy of her neighbors. Her identity was entirely dependent on being perceived as the successful, devout wife of a prosperous local businessman. If the town discovered that Hank was a degenerate gambler buried in syndicate debt, her pristine social standing would collapse overnight. She would be transformed from a pillar of the community into an object of public pity. In the rigid hierarchy of our local society, social exile was a fate worse than death. Brenda could not stomach the thought of the mayor's wife or the pastor looking down on her. Faced with the destruction of her carefully curated facade, Brenda calculated the cost of survival. She decided that surrendering my 50 acres of virgin timberland was a fair price to pay to keep her Sunday service reputation spotless. She was willing to let a shadow banking cartel seize my grandfather's legacy just so she could continue organizing the annual Harvest Festival without a whisper of scandal attached to her name. The realization deepened as I considered the mechanics of the money laundering front. Brenda did not simply forge a document. She engineered the entire Fletcher eco-glamping illusion. She knew the sudden influx of $350,000 would raise suspicions at the local bank. She needed a plausible cover story to explain the capital to the town, and she needed a willing participant to act as the public face of the transaction. She weaponized Tara. My younger sister was vain, entitled, and desperate for validation. Brenda understood exactly how to manipulate those traits. She handed Tara the title of Chief Executive Officer, encouraged her to purchase a luxury truck, and watched with a supportive smile as Tara signed non-refundable contracts for imported ecodomes. Brenda manipulated her golden child into executing interstate wire transfers, effectively pointing a loaded gun at her favorite daughter just to shield her husband from the bookies. Tara was too dense to realize her fresh start was nothing more than a criminal meat shield. Brenda ensured Tara's fingerprints were all over the digital ledger, leaving herself hidden safely in the background. My mother was the orchestrator. She forged my signature to steal my land, fed my sister to a money laundering syndicate to move the cash, and launched a vicious whisper campaign about my mental health to ensure no one would believe me when I uncovered the truth. All of it was executed to protect a degenerate gambler and a fragile social ego. A profound, quiet clarity settled over my mind. For weeks, a tiny fraction of familial guilt had lingered in the back of my conscience. I had wrestled with the idea of sending my own father to a federal penitentiary. I had wondered if my actions were too harsh, or if the Ozark tradition of keeping family matters private should carry some weight. The pink recipe card erased every trace of that hesitation. The betrayal was total. They were not victims of circumstance. They were predators who viewed my life as a harvestable resource. They demanded my loyalty while offering me up as collateral to a violent cartel. I picked up my phone and dialed Wyatt Sterling. The attorney answered immediately, noting the late hour. I told him I had finished reviewing the corporate filings and the signature patterns. I informed him that my mother was the one who executed the forgery and that the glamping business was a verified front for a Little Rock sports betting syndicate. Wyatt let out a low whistle. He stated that the involvement of an underground betting ring elevated the danger significantly. The bagman Trent had already threatened me in the woods. The syndicate was expecting the final reserve disbursement by the end of the week. If they did not receive their money, they would bypass my father and come directly for the guarantor listed on the paperwork. They would come for me. I told Wyatt I was not going to wait for a group of desperate debt collectors to arrive at my cabin. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade. I instructed him to prepare the comprehensive identity theft affidavit. I wanted it filed with the federal authorities, the State Gaming Commission, and the primary fraud division of the Shadow Lenders Parent Institution by morning. Wyatt confirmed he had the paperwork drafted and ready. He warned me that once he submitted the files, an automatic, irreversible chain reaction would begin within the banking system. There would be no turning back. The federal algorithms would lock everything down, and the fallout would be swift and devastating. I told him to file the documents. I owed my parents absolutely no mercy. I hung up the phone, walked to the wood stove in the corner of my living room, and tossed the pink recipe card into the dying embers. The paper curled, darkened, and burst into a brief, bright flame before disintegrating into ash. I watched it burn, feeling nothing but the cold, steady anticipation of the morning. My mother thought she could bury me under a mountain of lies and social pressure. She was about to discover that a woman who makes her living navigating the wilderness knows exactly how to survive a fire. The trap was set, the invisible tripwire was armed, and the Fletcher family was going to wake up to a world where their stolen money no longer existed. The digital clock on my microwave glowed a neon green, reading 5:15 in the morning. I stood in the center of my small kitchen, listening to the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker. The mountain air seeping through the window screens carried the sharp scent of damp pine needles and impending frost. I poured the dark liquid into a ceramic travel mug, feeling the heat radiate against my palms. Today was the day the timber finally fell. I carried the mug to my drafting desk and opened my laptop. Wyatt Sterling was already waiting in the secure digital conference room. He looked sharp, wide awake, and highly focused. He had spent the entire night compiling the evidence into a series of irrefutable legal packets. We had the recorded audio from the diner, the high-definition trail camera footage of Trent's physical intimidation, the verified signature analysis proving my mother forged the notary documents, and the financial tracking maps proving the funds were being laundered to an underground sports betting syndicate. Wyatt asked me if I was ready to initiate the final sequence. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. I told him to execute the filings. I watched his screen share as he navigated the complex portals of institutional justice. He did not file a localized police report. He submitted a comprehensive sworn identity theft affidavit directly to the federal authorities. The dossier went simultaneously to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division, the State Gaming Commission, and the Central Fraud Department of the Little Rock Shadow Banking Syndicate. There was no dramatic fanfare. There were no sirens echoing through the Ozark valleys. There was only the quiet click of a computer mouse and a green confirmation bar flashing across the screen. Wyatt leaned back in his leather office chair. He explained the mechanics of the invisible tripwire we had just tripped. The shadow banking network operates on aggressive, automated risk management algorithms. They loan capital to high-risk ventures, but the moment an asset is contested by a federal identity theft claim, their compliance software takes absolute control. Human intervention is removed from the equation. I closed the laptop, walked out the front door, and sat on the wooden steps of my porch. The horizon was just beginning to lighten, painting the jagged silhouettes of the mountain ridges in soft hues of charcoal and indigo. I rested my forearms on my knees, cradling the coffee mug, and watched the Ozark sunrise. My grandfather taught me everything I knew about patience right on this very porch. He was a man who understood the value of stillness. When he taught me how to track white-tailed deer in the deep woods, he emphasized that movement is the enemy of success. You do not rush the target. You find a vantage point, you control your breathing, and you wait for the environment to align perfectly in your favor. My parents never understood that concept. Brenda and Hank were creatures of constant, loud motion. They schemed, they gossiped, they scrambled to maintain their fragile social standing, always reacting to the immediate pressure of their own bad decisions. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness. They failed to realize that while they were making noise, I was simply waiting for the perfect broadside shot. As the sun broke over the eastern ridge, flooding the valley with brilliant golden light, I knew exactly what was happening in the digital realm. The algorithmic tripwire was moving at the speed of light. The Shadowlenders servers in Little Rock communicated with the federal databases in Washington. The flag on my Social Security number triggered a cascade of automated security protocols. In less time than it takes to draw a single breath, the Fletcher Eco Glamping Limited Liability Company was financially decapitated. The $350,000 commercial account was instantly locked. The routing numbers were severed. The remaining reserve capital was quarantined in a federal holding vault. The active credit lines were permanently revoked, the balances plunging to zero. Furthermore, the county clerk automated system flagged the quitclaim deed on my 50 acres as contested, effectively neutralizing the syndicate's collateral claim. The financial blood supply feeding my parents' criminal operation was completely shut off. While the digital world aggressively secured my stolen identity, my younger sister was operating in the physical world, completely oblivious to the traps snapping shut around her ankles. Brody Lawson sent a brief, encrypted text message to my phone just before 8 in the morning. He had been monitoring the corporate shell accounts and tracking the vendor communications. He informed me that Tara was currently sitting in a boutique coffee shop in downtown Bentonville, meeting face-to-face with the regional supplier for the luxury ecodomes. Tara was playing the role of the wealthy, sophisticated entrepreneur to the very end. According to the supplier correspondence Brody intercepted, she had scheduled this breakfast meeting to finalize the delivery logistics for the imported canvas tents. She wanted to document the transaction for her social media followers. She was likely wearing another pristine designer outfit, sipping an artisanal latte, and boasting about her visionary outdoor hospitality concept. The secondary conflict materialized with breathtaking arrogance. To secure the expedited shipping timeline, the supplier demanded the remaining $40,000 balance up front. Tara did not hesitate. She opened a leather-bound corporate checkbook, clicked an expensive silver pen, and wrote out a physical, handwritten check for the full amount. She handed that piece of paper to the supplier with a confident, entitled smile, entirely unaware that the account backing that signature had been federally frozen 2 hours earlier. By drafting and presenting that physical instrument, Tara escalated her own legal peril. She was no longer just a gullible pawn operating a digital ledger. She had just committed the felony of passing a fraudulent check across state vendor lines. She handed a worthless piece of paper to a legitimate business owner, sealing her own fate in ink. I read Brody's message and set my phone down on the wooden porch railing. The Ozark morning was fully awake now. The birds were singing, the wind was rustling the pine branches, and the temperature was beginning to rise. I felt a profound, settling calm wash over my entire body. The meticulous preparation was complete, the evidence was secured, the authorities were notified. The bomb was successfully planted directly beneath the foundation of the Fletcher family facade. All of the fuses were lit, burning silently through the dark. I finished the last cold drop of my coffee and stood up. I walked back inside my cabin to get dressed for the day. I selected a clean-pressed flannel shirt and my favorite pair of durable work boots. I knew I would not be conducting any soil surveys today. The banking institutions operate on standard business hours. The automated clearinghouses process transactions precisely at mid-morning. When the clock struck 10, the shock waves would begin to hit the surface. The checks would bounce. The credit cards would decline. The syndicate lenders would realize their collateral was a forgery, and they would unleash their own brutal brand of debt collection on my father. My mother would realize her carefully constructed narrative of my mental incompetence could not stop a federal subpoena. I tied my bootlaces ready to face the inevitable fallout. They had spent weeks trying to break my spirit and steal my legacy. Now they were about to discover what happens when you corner a woman who knows exactly how to navigate the wilderness. The countdown had reached 0, and the absolute destruction of their false empire was only minutes away. The automated clearinghouse network operates with ruthless precision. It does not care about family dynamics, social reputations, or Southern hospitality. It only processes mathematics. I sat at my drafting desk and watched the clock on my computer monitor turn to 10:14 in the morning. That was the exact minute the financial fallout struck the Fletcher family. The invisible tripwire I had armed hours earlier finally caught their ankles, and the resulting detonation was spectacular. Brody Lawson kept a real-time digital watch on the frozen accounts, relaying the sequence of events to a secure dashboard on my screen. The collapse began in a luxury furniture boutique located in an upscale shopping district in Bentonville. Tara had walked into the showroom feeling like a wealthy entrepreneur. She selected a massive, custom-built reception desk crafted from reclaimed barnwood and poured epoxy resin. The price tag was staggering, an amount most people would consider a down payment on a modest home. Tara did not blink. She approached the sales counter, tossed her sleek new corporate credit card onto the glass surface, and expected the retail clerk to treat her like royalty. The clerk inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine processed the request for exactly 4 seconds before emitting a sharp, negative tone. The screen flashed a red error message. Declined. Tara likely offered a condescending laugh, blaming the bank for placing a temporary hold on her massive corporate spending. She confidently instructed the clerk to run the card a second time. The clerk complied. The machine produced the same harsh rejection. Frustrated, Tara pulled out her phone and dialed the automated customer service number printed on the back of the card. She expected to navigate a brief security menu and authorize the purchase. Instead, she was greeted by a pre-recorded institutional message. The voice informed her that the corporate account ending in her specific 4 digits was currently locked under a federal investigative hold. It instructed her to contact the Department of Justice White-Collar Crime Division for further information. The reality of her situation must have crashed down upon her like a collapsing roof. The $40,000 handwritten check she gave the Ecodome supplier at breakfast was currently routing through that exact same frozen account. By the end of the business day, that check would violently bounce. The supplier would file a police report for check fraud. Tara was standing in a high-end retail store holding a worthless piece of plastic, entirely oblivious to the fact that her name was now tied to a federal wire fraud investigation. She had played the role of the visionary founder, and now she was going to play the role of the primary suspect. While Tara experienced her first taste of public humiliation, my father was facing a much more dangerous reality back at the house. Hank spent his mornings sitting in his home office, surrounded by framed photographs of himself shaking hands with minor local politicians. He liked to project the aura of a successful real estate mogul, despite the fact that his bank accounts were perpetually overdrawn. At exactly 10:20 in the morning, a certified legal correspondence bypassed his standard email filter and landed in his primary inbox. It was an urgent communication from the Little Rock Shadow Lending Syndicate. The tone of the message was stripped of all professional courtesy. The legal department informed Hank that the county clerk had flagged the quitclaim deed on my 50 acres as actively contested under an identity theft claim. The syndicate stated that their primary collateral was now considered toxic. The email contained a stark, uncompromising ultimatum. The lender demanded that Zelda Fletcher appear in person at their Little Rock headquarters by the close of business tomorrow to provide physical identity verification and a notarized signature confirmation. If I failed to appear, the $350,000 commercial loan would be placed into immediate default. Hank understood the violent translation behind that legal jargon. The betting syndicate recognized that my father had attempted to secure his gambling debts with a forged, fraudulent asset. He had tried to scam an organized criminal enterprise. The bookies were no longer going to send a weak bagman like Trent to issue vague threats in the woods. They were going to escalate their collection methods, and my father possessed absolutely no financial shield to protect his own knees. His cowardly shortcut had just placed him directly in the crosshairs of ruthless men. The sheer terror experienced by my sister and my father immediately funneled upward to the true architect of the disaster. Brenda Fletcher suddenly found herself standing in the rubble of her own master plan. Her stolen money was quarantined. Her husband was a target for a shadow cartel. Her golden child was distributing fraudulent checks across state lines. The pristine, matriarchal image she valued above her own soul was inches away from total public obliteration. When manipulative people lose control of their environment, they invariably lash out at the person who refused to comply. The assault on my phone began at 10:30. The screen lit up with an incoming call from my mother. I did not answer. I let the device vibrate against the wooden surface of my desk. A minute later, Hank called. Then Tara called. The cycle repeated with frantic, escalating urgency. I sat perfectly still, watching the missed call counter climb higher and higher. Within a single hour, my phone registered 42 missed calls. They were desperately trying to force me back into the tiny, obedient box they had constructed for me over 30 years. At 11:15, Brenda finally stopped dialing and left a voicemail. I opened the audio file, curious to hear the sound of a crumbling empire. The voice transmitting through the speaker did not belong to the sweet pie-baking church lady the town adored. The melodic southern drawl was completely gone, replaced by a shrill, venomous panic. Brenda was breathing heavily, the stress causing her words to clip and fracture. She demanded that I answer the phone immediately. She commanded me to call the federal authorities and tell them there had been a simple clerical error. She actually referred to her premeditated, forged commercial loan theft as a minor paperwork glitch. Her tone shifted from demands to vicious accusations. She screamed into the receiver, her voice breaking under the strain of her own terror. She accused me of being a selfish, vindictive daughter. She said I was actively destroying the family over a petty misunderstanding. She claimed my refusal to cooperate was going to ruin my sister's life and send my father to an early grave. She threw every ounce of emotional leverage she possessed into that 2-minute audio recording, hoping the sheer force of her guilt trip would break my resolve. I listened to the entire voicemail without my heart rate increasing a single beat. Her words held no power over me anymore. I recognized her panic for exactly what it was. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had stepped squarely into a steel trap. I switched my phone to silent mode and placed it face down on the desk. I turned my attention back to the window, watching the wind rustle the pine branches. I did not need to engage in a screaming match. I was perfectly content to let the arithmetic of my actions do the talking. My parents were currently trapped in a rapidly collapsing lie, desperately trying to spend money that had evaporated into federal evidence. They thought they could outsmart the banking system, outrun the betting syndicate, and outmaneuver their quiet daughter. They were wrong on all 3 counts. The digital silence in my cabin felt like a profound victory. But I knew Brenda Fletcher would not surrender simply because a phone went unanswered. A woman who builds her entire identity on social dominance will inevitably attempt to leverage the community to force compliance. If she could not bully me in private, she would construct a public arena designed to trap me. Hours later, an electronic calendar invitation bypassed my silent phone and appeared directly on my computer screen. Brenda had bypassed the standard text messages and sent a formal digital summons. She requested my presence at a mandatory family dinner this upcoming Sunday. The guest list was attached to the file. It included extended relatives, local business owners, and Pastor Miller. She was organizing a massive, orchestrated intervention. She planned to ambush me in front of an audience using the crushing weight of peer pressure to force me to sign a retroactive authorization form and save them from prison. She was preparing a stage for my ultimate surrender. She had no idea I was going to use her carefully constructed stage to burn her entire world to the ground. The digital calendar invitation was just the initial flare. The real weapon arrived in my rural mailbox on Friday afternoon. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope featuring a raised gold foil border. My mother used this specific premium stationery for weddings, high-profile baptisms, and funerals. Now she was utilizing it for an extortion plot disguised as a polite family gathering. The elegant looping cursive spelled out an invitation to an elaborate Sunday dinner. She did not ask if I was available. She issued a formal summons. I knew exactly what awaited me inside that house. Brenda Fletcher never fought her battles in private when she felt she was losing ground. She preferred the advantage of a captive audience. By inviting Pastor Miller, my extended relatives, and a few prominent local business owners, she was constructing a social coliseum. She intended to seat me squarely in the center ring. Her strategy was transparent and chillingly effective. She would wait until the yeast rolls were passed and the sweet tea was poured. Then she would present a retroactive authorization waiver. She would weep delicate tears, spinning a tragic tale about my alleged mental fragility. She would tell the room that the family was simply trying to rescue my younger sister's business from my erratic, forgetful mistakes. She planned to use the crushing weight of Ozark community peer pressure to break my will. The logic was insidious. If I refused to sign the waiver in front of the pastor and the local elders, I would cement her false narrative. I would look like a cruel, unstable spinster destroying her own blood relatives. If I signed it, the bank fraud would be legalized, the shadow syndicate would receive their money, and my parents would walk away unpunished, leaving me to shoulder a $350,000 debt. It was a perfect, suffocating trap. If I raised my voice, I was hysterical. If I walked out, I was abandoning my loved ones. If I surrendered, I lost my grandfather's legacy. Brenda engineered a scenario where my only perceived exit was through total capitulation. For the first 30 years of my life, a cream-colored envelope like that would have sent me into a spiral of deep anxiety. I would have spent the entire weekend pacing the hardwood floors of my cabin, dreading the confrontation, wondering how I could bend myself to appease them. I would have drafted apologies in my head for crimes I never committed. But the woman who retrieved that envelope from the mailbox was not the compliant daughter they raised. She was a forester who had just exposed a syndicate money laundering front. I did not throw the invitation in the trash. I placed it on my kitchen counter and pulled out my phone. I accepted the digital calendar invite, ensuring Brenda received the electronic notification. I wanted her to feel a false sense of security. I wanted her to spend Saturday preparing her pot roast and practicing her fake tears in the mirror, convinced she had successfully cornered her prey. Then I dialed Wyatt Sterling. Wyatt picked up on the first ring. I outlined my mother's strategy step by step. The defense attorney listened silently, his legal mind analyzing the social dynamics of the impending ambush. I told him I was going to attend the dinner. I was going to walk directly into the center of the trap. However, I needed him and Brody Lawson to join me. I did not want them to arrive in my truck. I instructed them to park a block away from the house and wait for my text message. They were going to be my cavalry, but I intended to draw the enemy fire first. Wyatt agreed to the plan. He understood the tactical value of timing. He and Brody had spent their careers dismantling complex corporate fraud, but they rarely had the opportunity to watch the perpetrators implode in a domestic setting. Brody Lawson spent 15 years at the Department of Justice tracing hidden offshore accounts. He was a man who spoke very little, preferring the concrete reality of banking ledgers to the fluid nature of human excuses. He found domestic financial crimes particularly distasteful because the betrayals were always so intimate. Having Brody in the room would provide an undeniable, objective anchor to the truth. We synchronized our watches. The stage was set. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy, humid stillness that often precedes a severe mountain thunderstorm. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I did not wear my usual flannel shirts, denim jeans, or scuffed work boots. I was not going to give them the visual satisfaction of the rugged, overworked forester they had described in their Church Whisper campaign. I needed to look like a woman who owned her future and recognized her own power. I chose a tailored navy blue blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, and dark-fitted trousers. I secured my hair back in a sleek, uncompromising style. I clipped on a pair of simple, understated gold earrings my grandmother had given me before she passed away. They were a quiet reminder of the true legacy I was fighting to protect. I looked at my reflection. My posture was straight. My gaze was steady. I was wearing armor constructed of silk and wool. I picked up a thick manila envelope containing the red-tabbed federal fraud dossier. This was the weapon I was bringing to their gunfight. It held the forged notary documents, the financial routing numbers, the trail camera photos, and the audio transcripts. The drive to my parents' house took 20 minutes. I navigated the familiar winding roads, the same route I had traveled 1,000 times for holidays and birthdays. Every previous trip had been marked by a dull, aching obligation. Today, I felt only a sharp, icy anticipation. I turned onto their manicured suburban street. The contrast between my isolated federal timberland and their pristine, curated neighborhood was stark. The driveway was packed with vehicles. I recognized Pastor Miller's conservative sedan parked near the mailbox. My Aunt Martha's silver crossover was angled near the lawn. Aunt Martha was the biggest gossip in the county, invited specifically by Brenda to broadcast my surrender to the rest of the town by morning. A few polished luxury cars belonging to town council members lined the curb. Trent's sleek, blacked-out sport utility vehicle was parked near the garage doors. The bagman had apparently recovered enough nerve to show his face. The betting syndicate likely ordered him to attend the dinner to ensure the paperwork was signed tonight, punishing him for his prior failure in the woods. The entire cast of characters was assembled: the orchestrators, the pawns, the enforcers, and the audience. I parked my truck on the street directly behind the pastor's sedan. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet cab for 60 seconds. I reviewed the sequence of events in my mind. I ran my thumb over the edge of the manila envelope, feeling the weight of the paper inside. I took one deep, stabilizing breath of the humid evening air. I sent a quick, one-word text message to Wyatt. The word was ready. I stepped out of the truck. The heavy door shut with a solid, echoing thud. The gravel crunched beneath my polished shoes as I walked up the driveway. The house looked picture-perfect from the outside. The porch lights cast a warm, inviting glow across the manicured lawn. The front door was adorned with a seasonal floral wreath. It was a beautiful, flawless facade, hiding a foundation of total rot. I climbed the brick steps. I could hear the muted hum of polite conversation and the clinking of silverware filtering through the front windows. They were inside eating appetizers, drinking sweet tea, and waiting for the unstable daughter to arrive and surrender her inheritance. I reached out and turned the brass handle. I pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold, preparing to show them exactly what happens when you mistake silence for submission. I stepped out of the warm, humid evening air and crossed the threshold into my parents' foyer. The low hum of polite conversation radiating from the dining room died the instant my shoes clicked against the hardwood floor. I walked through the arched doorway and took my place at the table. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat yeast rolls and unspoken tension. My mother had orchestrated the seating arrangement with tactical precision. I was placed near the center of the long mahogany table. Pastor Miller sat directly across from me, radiating quiet moral authority. Aunt Martha sat to my left, her eyes darting around the room, eager to absorb every detail of the impending drama so she could broadcast it to the county by morning. Several local business owners occupied the remaining chairs. At the far end of the table, my sister Tara sat next to Trent. The bagman looked pale. his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. Hank and Brenda anchored the head of the table, presiding over their curated audience. The meal was a masterclass in psychological theater. We passed serving dishes and filled our plates in a suffocating quiet, punctuated only by the scrape of silverware against fine china. Brenda guided the pacing of the dinner, ensuring everyone was comfortable and fed before she sprang the trap. She waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured. Then she initiated her performance. Brenda stood up at the head of the table. She gently tapped her spoon against her crystal water glass to command the room's attention. She lowered her head, retrieved a delicate lace handkerchief from her sleeve, and dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes. She delivered a monologue worthy of a stage actress. She spoke about the profound importance of family loyalty. She told the guests how much she loved her eldest daughter, but how my demanding career in the isolated timberlands had taken a devastating toll on my fragile mind. She spun her web with terrifying grace. She painted me as a confused, overworked woman who was losing her grip on reality. She claimed that my erratic behavior was jeopardizing my sister's brilliant new business venture. She told the pastor and the business owners that the family was simply trying to step in and manage my complicated assets for my own protection. With her narrative firmly established, Brenda reached into a leather portfolio resting on a side table. She produced a single piece of crisp white paper. It was the retroactive authorization waiver. She walked down the length of the dining room and placed the document directly in front of me. She set a silver pen right beside it. She placed a warm maternal hand on my shoulder and urged me to sign the paper. She told me to let the family carry the heavy burden, promising that everything would be okay if I just surrendered control. The guests watched me with profound pity. They genuinely believed they were witnessing a loving intervention for a sick woman. I did not reach for the silver pen. I reached into the thick manila envelope resting on my lap. I pulled out the red-tabbed federal fraud dossier. I placed my hand flat against the heavy cardstock and slid it across the mahogany grain. It glided smoothly past the salt shakers, stopping mere inches from my mother's famous Sunday pot roast. I leaned back in my chair, looked directly at my parents, and offered them 3 choices. I told them they could sign a full confession right now, hand over the deed to their house, or sit there and wait for the federal agents to knock on the front door. The pity in the room evaporated, replaced by sudden electric shock. Hank jumped to his feet. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He recognized the imminent threat and fell back on the only defense he had left. He leaned hard into the whisper campaign. He looked at the pastor and raised his hands in a gesture of helpless frustration. Hank declared that I was having a paranoid episode. He apologized to the guests for my terrible outburst. He pointed at the red tab dossier and told the room it was nothing more than the delusional ramblings of an unstable spinster who had spent too much time alone in the woods. He ordered me to stop embarrassing the family and sign the waiver. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to argue with a liar. I simply picked up my phone. My father loved to boast about his wealth by outfitting his home with expensive electronics. He had recently installed a high-end wireless surround sound system in the ceiling of the dining room. He always used it to play soft classical music during his dinner parties. I opened the settings application on my phone and paired my device to his unsecured network. A soft electronic chime echoed from the ceiling speakers, announcing the successful connection. I opened the Secure Cloud folder on my screen. I selected the first audio file. I pressed play. The acoustics of the dining room amplified the recording with flawless clarity. The sound of clinking coffee cups from the local diner filled the air. Then my father's voice boomed from the ceiling. The recorded version of Hank sounded remarkably proud. He bragged about calling in a favor from his friend Gary at the county title office. He laughed a deep, arrogant laugh as he explained how they used a backdated notary stamp to bypass the security protocols of the Little Rock Shadow Syndicate. The entire room listened as a prominent local businessman eagerly and explicitly confessed to committing federal bank fraud and document forgery. Hank opened his mouth, his jaw working silently, but no words came out. The blood drained entirely from his face. Before the room could process the first confession, I selected the second audio file. The ambient noise shifted from a crowded diner to the windy Ozark Trail. Trent's voice erupted from the speakers. The bagman sounded frantic and unhinged. He threatened to ruin my reputation. He demanded that I release the reserve funds immediately. He swore he would run me out of the state if I did not comply. Trent shrank down in his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. Tara stared at her fiancé in absolute horror. The reality of the syndicate pressure was no longer a hidden secret. The bagman had just broadcast his extortion attempt to the most influential citizens in the county. The objective truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The carefully constructed illusion was dead. Brenda looked desperately at Pastor Miller. She expected him to offer grace, to find some way to smooth over the jagged edges of her shattered reputation. Pastor Miller did not look at her. He reached out and carefully placed his linen napkin next to his untouched dessert plate. He stood up from his chair. He did not offer a prayer. He did not say a single word. He turned his back on the Fletcher family, walked straight down the hallway, opened the heavy wooden front door, and left the house. The pastor's silent departure broke the spell. The social coliseum instantly crumbled. Aunt Martha grabbed her purse from the floor, her eyes wide with terror. The local business owners suddenly realized they were sitting in a room where major federal crimes had just been confessed over dinner. If they stayed, they could be subpoenaed as witnesses in a federal racketeering investigation. They stood up in unison. The exodus was chaotic but completely silent. Chairs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. No one said goodbye. No one thanked Brenda for the meal. They practically trampled each other to escape the blast radius of the impending federal indictment. The front door slammed shut repeatedly, leaving a haunting, hollow quiet in its wake. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I had not raised my voice once. I had not shed a single tear. In less than 5 minutes, I had entirely dismantled 30 years of my mother's carefully curated social power. The dining room was empty except for the 5 of us. The audience was gone. The whispering campaign was dead. The crushing weight of the federal dossier remained on the table. My parents were finally trapped in a room with the undeniable truth, and the resulting panic was about to turn them into starving wolves. The front door latch clicked into place, sealing the 5 of us inside a tomb of mahogany and cold pot roast. The silence was profound. For 30 years, my parents demanded unquestioning allegiance. They preached that blood was thicker than water, that the Fletcher name was a sacred bond requiring infinite sacrifice. I sat motionless at the center of the table, observing the exact moment that sacred bond dissolved into pure, feral self-preservation. When cornered by the undeniable threat of a federal penitentiary, thieves do not link arms and stand together. They turn their teeth inward. Hank broke the quiet first. The color had returned to his face, but it was not the flush of embarrassment. It was the dark, mottled crimson of a cornered animal. He did not apologize for his hidden gambling debts. He did not beg for my forgiveness. He slammed his fist down onto the tabletop, rattling the crystal water glasses, and aimed his fury entirely at his wife. He yelled at Brenda, his voice cracking under the strain of his own terror. He blamed her for botching the forgery. He called her careless and stupid for leaving a traceable handwriting sample on a highly monitored commercial loan document. He accused her of ruining his life because her fragile ego could not handle a simple credit check. Brenda did not absorb the verbal assault with her usual sweet, submissive grace. The Southern matriarch was dead, replaced by a vicious combatant fighting for her freedom. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs screeching harshly against the floor. She fired back with equal venom. She reminded Hank that she only stepped in to forge the deed because his hands were shaking too much to hold the silver pen. She pointed a trembling finger at his chest, declaring that his degenerate sports betting addiction was the sole reason the Little Rock bookies were threatening their lives. She exposed his cowardice, shouting that he was willing to let his own daughter face a cartel bagman just to save his kneecaps. Their marriage had always been a transactional arrangement, built on a foundation of mutual enabling and shared superiority. Watching them tear each other apart was like observing a controlled demolition. The structural integrity failed, and the debris rained down on the weakest person in the room. Seeking a new scapegoat to absorb the blame, Brenda pivoted her attack toward her favorite child. She turned her rage onto Tara. My mother accused my younger sister of being a shallow, attention-seeking liability. She shrieked that the entire money laundering operation would have remained hidden if Tara had not paraded her vanity across social media. Brenda blamed the high-resolution photographs, the location tags, and the public bragging for drawing a digital map straight to their front door. She told her golden child that her desperate need for online validation had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a silver platter of evidence. Tara sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide, absorbing the brutal verbal lashing from the woman who had spent decades shielding her from every minor consequence. The favored daughter was finally experiencing the harsh reality of accountability, but the most devastating betrayal was yet to come. While my family engaged in their vicious circular firing squad, Trent saw an opportunity. The bagman slowly stood up, keeping his head down, and began inching toward the hallway. He recognized a sinking ship and intended to slip out the side door before the authorities arrived. He did not care about the glamping business. He certainly did not care about his fiancée. He only cared about escaping the blast radius of a federal indictment. Tara saw him moving. The panic in her chest exploded into action. She reached out and grabbed Trent by the sleeve of his designer windbreaker, begging him to stay. She pleaded with him to explain the situation to the syndicate, to fix the mess he had promised would make them rich. She cried out that they were supposed to be partners in this venture. Trent yanked his arm free with brutal force. He looked down at the woman he had promised to marry, his expression devoid of any affection. He delivered the final, fatal blow to her delusion. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. He told her she was nothing more than a convenient signature. He explained that his employers needed a clean name with no prior criminal record to open the corporate accounts. He stated plainly that she was the one who signed the banking paperwork. She was the one who wrote the fraudulent checks. She was the one whose name was attached to the interstate wire transfers. He informed her that the bookies had already written off the loan, and the federal agents would be looking exclusively at her financial footprint. He turned his back on her, marched down the hallway, and exited the house, leaving Tara holding an empty promise and a mountain of federal liability. My sister collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Deep, racking sobs shook her shoulders. She finally understood her role in the Fletcher family dynamic. She was never the visionary entrepreneur. She was a human shield, groomed by her mother and manipulated by a parasite, destined to take the fall for crimes she barely comprehended. I watched the chaotic implosion from my seat at the dining table. A profound, bitter irony settled over the room. For my entire life, my parents demanded my silent loyalty. They expected me to sacrifice my inheritance, my credit score, and my future to protect their reputation. Yet when faced with the actual consequences of their own actions, they could not maintain their loyalty to each other for 5 minutes. They cannibalized their own family unit to save themselves. I stood up from the table. The movement drew their attention, briefly halting the shouting match. Hank, Brenda, and Tara looked at me with varying expressions of desperation and dread. They were standing in the wreckage of their false empire, waiting for me to offer a lifeline. I did not offer salvation. I offered the cold, mathematical reality of their tomorrow. I picked up my phone and slipped it into my blazer pocket. I left the red-tabbed federal fraud dossier sitting on the table next to the untouched food. I looked at my father and delivered the final piece of the puzzle. I informed him that the Little Rock shadow lender was not just going to absorb a $350,000 loss. Because the initial loan disbursement was acquired through material misrepresentation and identity theft, the commercial lien on my 50 acres of timberland was legally void. I explained that the bank would be seeking full, immediate restitution for the missing capital. Since my grandfather's timberland was no longer viable collateral, the syndicate would automatically execute a claim against the only other tangible asset attached to the fraudulent holding company. To secure the lowest possible interest rate on the shadow loan Hank and Brenda had secretly cross-collateralized their own primary residence. They had bet their own roof on my silent compliance. I told them the lenders would come for the very house we were currently standing in. I turned my back on their stunned, silent faces. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and stepped out the front door into the humid Ozark night. I did not look back. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from the pristine suburban neighborhood. I felt a deep, resonant peace settling into my bones. The psychological warfare was over. The institutional justice system was awake. My parents thought they could steal my land, but they failed to realize I was about to own their consequences. When morning broke, the men with the tow trucks and the foreclosure notices would begin their march, bringing a swift and terrible physical reality to the digital trap I had just closed. Monday morning brought a swift and ruthless brand of institutional justice to the Ozark Valley. The federal holds and algorithmic alerts were no longer confined to digital banking screens. They manifested into physical, undeniable consequences. The Little Rock Shadow Lending Syndicate did not operate like a traditional community bank. They did not send polite reminder letters or offer grace periods for missed payments. When a hard money lender realizes their primary collateral is tied to a federal identity theft investigation, they move to mitigate their financial exposure with breathtaking speed. They dispatch retrieval teams to secure whatever tangible assets remain before the federal authorities seize them as evidence. The sun had barely burned the morning mist off the mountain roads when the heavy machinery arrived at the leased parcel of land Tara intended to use for her resort. The site was nothing more than an empty dirt lot bordered by a few scrub pines. Tara had driven out there early, likely seeking refuge from the toxic atmosphere of our parents' home. She was probably trying to film a social media update to maintain her false entrepreneurial narrative, standing in the mud while wearing her designer boots. Her performance was interrupted by the grinding roar of a diesel engine. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck rolled onto the unpaved lot. The driver did not step out to negotiate. He backed the flatbed directly toward the gleaming pearl metallic custom pickup truck Tara had purchased just days prior. Tara rushed toward the tow operator, demanding he stop. She tried to leverage her fabricated authority, waving her arms and insisting there was a banking error that her accountant was resolving. The operator ignored her. Men who repossess vehicles for shadow syndicates are immune to tears and entitlement. He dropped the steel ramp, secured the heavy chains around the front axle of the luxury vehicle, and engaged the mechanical winch. The screech of straining metal echoed through the quiet valley as the $75,000 prop was dragged onto the flatbed. Before Tara could even process the loss of her vehicle, a second commercial transport truck pulled onto the dirt lot. This one belonged to the regional supplier based in Tennessee. The $40,000 handwritten check Tara provided at breakfast the previous week had bounced during the morning clearing cycle. The supplier was not going to wait for a police investigation to recover his inventory. A crew of laborers stepped out of the cab and began loading the heavy wooden crates containing the imported canvas eco-domes back onto their transport trailer. Tara stood alone in the center of the muddy lot. The tow truck and the transport trailer drove away, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. Her phone was silent. Her corporate credit cards were worthless plastic. The grand vision of the Fletcher Eco Glamping Resort evaporated into the mountain air, leaving her stranded without a vehicle, without a business, and without the wealthy fiancé who had manipulated her into the crosshairs of federal investigators. She was forced to walk 3 miles down the shoulder of the county highway just to find a gas station to call a taxi. While Tara faced the grim reality of her ruined fresh start, a far more devastating legal maneuver was unfolding in the pristine suburban neighborhood across town. When my parents forged the commercial loan documents, they recognized that my 50 acres of raw timberland might not satisfy the strict underwriting requirements of a predatory lending syndicate. Unimproved land carries inherent risk. To secure the $350,000 principal and lock in a lower interest rate, Hank and Brenda made a fatal, arrogant calculation. They authorized a cross-collateralization clause. They secretly pledged their own primary residence as secondary backing for the debt. They bet the roof over their own heads, entirely convinced I would remain the quiet, submissive daughter and absorb the financial burden for them. The moment I filed the federal identity theft affidavit and nullified the lien on my timberland, the syndicate immediately executed their claim on the secondary collateral. At 10 in the morning, a process server walked up the manicured brick steps of my parents' home. He did not care about the seasonal floral wreath on the front door or the spotless reputation of the woman living inside. He handed Hank a thick stack of legal documents. It was a formal notice of acceleration and intent to foreclose. The shadow lender demanded the immediate repayment of the entire loan balance. Because the funds were obtained through material misrepresentation and wire fraud, the standard foreclosure timelines were bypassed. My parents were given a matter of days to vacate the premises before the property was seized and auctioned to recover the stolen capital. Hank and Brenda possessed no savings to cure the default. Their credit profiles were frozen due to their proximity to the federal investigation. They could not refinance, they could not borrow from neighbors, and they could not outrun a syndicate backed by relentless corporate attorneys. The home they had used as a staging ground to belittle me for decades was slipping through their fingers. I observed the collapse from a comfortable distance. I sat in Wyatt Sterling's downtown office reviewing the public foreclosure filings displayed on his conference room monitor. Brody Lawson sat across the table sipping black coffee. The private investigator had been monitoring the syndicate's asset recovery strategy. He presented an intriguing piece of financial intelligence. The Little Rock Syndicate was currently bleeding cash. The federal freeze on the Fletcher corporate accounts meant the stolen capital was locked in government limbo. The bookies needed liquid assets immediately to cover their own underground obligations. They did not want to endure the lengthy, expensive process of officially foreclosing on a suburban home, evicting the residents, preparing the property for the real estate market, and waiting for a traditional buyer. They wanted to offload the toxic debt quickly to anyone holding clean, untraceable cash. They were quietly offering the promissory note on my parents' house to private distressed asset investors at a steep discount. Wyatt looked at me across the polished table. He explained the legal mechanics of purchasing distressed debt. If an independent investor bought the promissory note from the syndicate, that investor would assume all the rights of the original lender. The new owner of the debt would hold the deed to the property and possess the absolute legal authority to execute the eviction. I looked at the photograph of the pristine suburban house displayed on the monitor. For 30 years, that structure served as a monument to my mother's vanity and my father's ego. They hosted holiday dinners at that mahogany table, carving the turkey while slicing away at my self-esteem. They relegated me to the background, treating my quiet nature as a character flaw, while they poured their resources into a golden child and a gambling addiction. They looked down on my rustic cabin, my scuffed work boots, and my weathered forestry truck. They thought my modest lifestyle was a sign of failure. They failed to realize that living frugally in the woods provided me with a distinct tactical advantage. While they spent their income maintaining an illusion of wealth, financing luxury cars and designer clothes on revolving credit, I saved my forestry consulting checks. I built a fortress of liquid capital. My credit profile was immaculate. My savings account was an untouched reservoir of hard-earned, legitimate money. I turned to Wyatt. I instructed him to immediately form a blind, limited liability company registered in Delaware to mask my identity. I told him to contact the Shadow Syndicate's legal representatives. We were going to make a cash offer to purchase the distressed promissory note on the Fletcher residence. Wyatt drafted the paperwork with surgical efficiency. Because the syndicate was desperate for liquid capital and eager to wash their hands of a loan tied to a federal fraud probe, they accepted our discounted offer without hesitation. The wire transfer was executed using my clean, verified funds. The transaction cleared the banking network by late afternoon. Brody handed me the final notarized document. I stared at the thick, watermarked paper. The feeling of the heavy cardstock between my fingers was profoundly grounding. It was not a forged power of attorney. It was a legitimate, legally binding transfer of ownership. The poetic justice of the transaction was absolute. My parents forged my signature in an attempt to steal my inheritance and force me to pay for their mistakes. Their greed triggered a chain reaction that stripped them of their own sanctuary. I used the very financial stability they mocked to purchase their ruined debt for pennies on the dollar. I did not just save my 50 acres of virgin timberland. I achieved a level of dominance they never thought possible. I stood up from the conference table, holding the deed to the house where I grew up. I was no longer the invisible, compliant daughter sitting at the edge of the dining room. I was their landlord. The federal authorities would handle the criminal charges, but I held the key to their immediate physical reality. The final stage of accountability was set, and I was going to deliver the eviction notice myself. 1 year has passed since the Sunday dinner that dismantled the Fletcher family facade. The Ozark Mountains do not hold on to secrets. The changing seasons wipe the landscape clean, burying old decay beneath fresh snowfall and vibrant spring growth. My life mirrored that natural cycle of renewal. The toxic underbrush was cleared away, allowing my own roots to finally take hold in the deep, rich soil. My forestry consulting firm is thriving. The initial regional contracts multiplied, expanding into lucrative partnerships with state conservation boards and private timber reserves. I hired a team of dedicated surveyors and purchased new equipment. I no longer drive a dented 9-year-old truck. The business provided the capital to secure my future, but the true foundation of my peace rests entirely on legal armor. The 50 acres of virgin timberland my grandfather left me are no longer vulnerable to forged signatures or predatory lending syndicates. Wyatt Sterling drafted an ironclad trust. The deed is locked inside a legal structure so robust that no relative shadow banker or debt collector can ever place a lien against the soil. It is a permanent sanctuary. That sanctuary was paid for in the currency of hard truths and enforced boundaries. The institutional justice system moved with a cold, mechanical rhythm, sweeping up the remnants of my parents' criminal ambition. I did not send a nameless county sheriff to deliver the final consequence of their actions. I drove to their pristine suburban neighborhood on a quiet Tuesday morning. I parked my truck in their driveway, walked up the brick steps, and handed my father the official eviction notice myself. The look on his face when he read the name of the new property owner was a study in profound, silent devastation. Hank and Brenda finally understood the fatal error of cross-collateralizing their primary residence to fund a money laundering operation. They gambled their shelter on the assumption that I would submit to their demands. They lost the bet. I gave them 30 days to vacate the premises. They packed their lives into cardboard boxes under the watchful eyes of their neighbors. The whisper campaign my mother started had backfired spectacularly. The town learned the truth about the federal fraud investigation and the shadow syndicate. The same church members who once ate my mother's casseroles now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. My parents moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy auto repair shop on the industrial edge of the county. There is no mahogany dining table to host elegant dinner parties. There is no manicured lawn to project an image of wealth. Their daily reality is dictated by the terms of a strict federal plea agreement. Hank avoided a federal prison sentence by cooperating with the authorities and providing detailed information on the Little Rock sports betting syndicate. However, the judge showed no leniency regarding the financial damage. Hank was convicted of wire fraud and identity theft. He was ordered to pay full restitution for the stolen funds. Today, my father works as a low-level shift manager at a regional hardware store. Every paycheck he earns is immediately garnished by the government. He spends his days organizing aisles of plumbing supplies, his wages redirected to satisfy the debt he incurred trying to outsmart a cartel. My younger sister also faced the harsh daylight of accountability. Without her manipulative fiancé to shield her, Tara had to answer for the fraudulent checks she distributed across state lines. She avoided incarceration due to her lack of a prior criminal record, but her credit profile is a wasteland. She can no longer secure financing for a luxury vehicle or sign a lease for an upscale apartment. The self-proclaimed visionary entrepreneur now works a minimum wage retail job at a local outlet mall. She clocks in, wears a polyester uniform, and folds clothes for tourists. The glamorous glamping resort exists only as a humiliating digital footprint she can never erase. I do not monitor their daily struggles. I do not drive past their apartment to gloat. I simply enforce the boundaries I constructed. I hold the deed to their former house, which I transformed into a profitable rental property. The monthly income from their lost sanctuary pays the property taxes on my timberland. The arithmetic of justice balances the scales without requiring my emotional participation. This morning, the Ozark air is crisp and clear. I am standing on the wraparound wooden porch of the new cabin I built on my grandfather's land. The structure is anchored deep into the mountain bedrock. The walls are constructed of thick cedar logs designed to withstand the harshest winter storms. The wide windows face the eastern ridge, offering a panoramic view of the forest canopy. It is a home built on hard work, honest capital, and uncompromising self-respect. I walk down the long gravel driveway to check the metal mailbox positioned near the main road. Among the standard utility bills and forestry catalogs, I find a single piece of premium stationery. It is a cream-colored envelope featuring a raised gold foil border. The handwriting on the front is unmistakable. It is the same heavy-handed cursive my mother used to forge my name on a commercial lending agreement. I carry the envelope back up to the cabin. I feel the weight of the thick paper in my hand. A year ago, the mere sight of this stationery would have triggered a spike of anxiety in my chest. I would have worried about the demands hidden inside. I would have braced myself for the incoming guilt trip. Today, my heart rate remains perfectly steady. I know exactly what the pages inside contain. Manipulative people who run out of leverage always resort to the same predictable tactics. The letter is undoubtedly filled with fake nostalgia. Brenda likely wrote about how much she misses our family holidays. She probably offered a superficial apology that subtly shifts the blame back onto circumstances out of her control. She is looking for an opening. She wants me to read the words, feel a twinge of daughterly obligation, and pick up the phone. She wants to reestablish the connection so she can slowly begin testing the perimeter of my boundaries once again. I do not open the envelope. I do not need to read the excuses of a woman who tried to feed me to a criminal syndicate to protect her own social standing. I walk into the living room and approach the cast iron wood stove that heats the cabin. The metal radiates a comforting, intense warmth. I unlatch the heavy iron door, revealing a bed of glowing orange embers from the morning fire. I hold the cream-colored envelope over the open stove. I let it slip from my fingers. The paper lands directly on the hot coals. The edges turn brown instantly. A small flame licks the corner of the envelope, spreading rapidly across the gold foil border. I stand there and watch the fire consume my mother's final attempt at manipulation. The paper curls inward, turning black and brittle before disintegrating into a pile of fine gray ash. The smoke rises up the metal chimney pipe, drawn out into the cold mountain wind, disappearing into the vast expanse of the Ozark sky. I close the iron door and secure the latch. The fire crackles, feeding on the remains of the past. People often misunderstand the concept of retaliation. They think true victory requires loud arguments, public shouting matches, and vindictive behavior. They believe you have to hurt the people who hurt you to balance the equation. But true freedom operates on a different frequency. Revenge is not about destroying the people who betrayed you. Their own reckless choices, their greed, and their lies will eventually accomplish that task without any assistance. The most devastating response you can offer a manipulator is your own irrelevance to their survival. True justice is about building a structure so strong, so legally and emotionally fortified, that toxic people can never reach you again. It is about understanding that your identity, your credit score, and your labor belong exclusively to you. Love does not require forged signatures. Motherhood is not a debt collector waiting to hand you an invoice. Family loyalty should never act as a camouflage for financial exploitation. I did not save my parents' house. I did not rescue my sister's vanity project. I did not protect the fragile, fake reputation my mother valued above her own children. I chose to save the only thing they could never replace. I saved myself. I built a life where my silence is no longer a symptom of submission, but a statement of absolute authority. I step back out onto the wooden porch and lean against the sturdy cedar railing. The sun climbs higher over the ridge, illuminating the tops of the ancient pine trees. The forest is healthy, the soil is secure, and the air belongs to me. So I leave you with a simple question to ask yourself the next time someone demands you shrink your boundaries to accommodate their bad behavior. If the people who raised you decided your future was acceptable collateral for their own mistakes, what would you do? Would you sign the paperwork and choose the comfortable illusion of peace? Or would you let the truth burn their empire to the ground and choose the cold, unyielding reality of your own dignity? Tell me your choice in the comments below. Thank you for listening to QT Told Stories. Remember that sometimes the most powerful sound a family can hear is the sound of a door locking from the outside.